Good morning. Let's look today at Philippians 4:4. Rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I will say rejoice. Let all men know your forbearance. The Lord is at hand. Have no anxiety about anything, but in everything by prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. And the peace of God, which passes all understanding, will keep your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus. We've looked at all the bits of this over the last few days. But this morning I woke up thinking, I wonder, as Paul was writing this letter to the Philippians, the people who loved the Lord, who lived in Philippi, in Macedonia, and in my mind, I could see Paul with his scribe. We believe he had a scribe who wrote down his thoughts as he was writing to the Philippians. And it is most probable that he wrote this letter when he was under house arrest in Rome during those 2 years at the end of the Acts of the Apostles, when he was in prison. So he wasn't free. He was imprisoned, awaiting trial under the emperor. And I wonder, as he was dictating this letter, I wouldn't be at all surprised if his mind didn't go back to what had happened in Philippi. One of the most exciting visits he ever had anywhere. He'd gone to Philippi in response to a vision, a call from God to go to Macedonia. He'd gone to Philippi. And he'd had wonderful experiences there and ended up in a dungeon, ill-treated, beaten, and in a dungeon, along with Silas, his companion. And what did they do in the prison? If you don't remember, it's in Acts 16. If you read from verse 11 to the end of the chapter, you'll read the account of what happened. But they were in prison, they'd been beaten, they were hurting, and they were in prison. And what did they do? They didn't moan, they didn't groan, they didn't get anxious about whether they'd be set free or not. What did they do? They sang hymns of praise to God. In the night, all the prisoners heard them. They were not berating God for what had happened to them. They were not angry. Their forbearance was evident. Their trust in the Lord is at hand. Have no anxiety about anything, but in everything, by prayer and supplication, let your requests be known to God with thanksgiving. And they were in the prison, singing. At midnight they were praying and singing hymns to God, and the prisoners were listening to them. They lived out what Paul was telling the people in his letter to do. They lived it out. They were a living example of this attitude to life that they had, that whatever circumstances they were in, they rejoiced in the Lord. They sang to God. They praised him. In the verses before, it said, the magistrates tore the garments off them and gave orders to beat them with rods. And when they'd inflicted many blows upon them, they threw them into prison, charging the jailer to keep them safely. Having received this charge, he put them into the inner prison and fastened their feet in the stocks. They weren't just in prison, they were in the stocks. And when you're in the stocks, you can't actually sleep comfortably, can you? If you're in the stocks. They lived it out. Paul and Silas lived this out. They sang to God when their backs and and arms and legs were injured and bruised when they were in the inner prison, which must have been foul and dark, terribly unpleasant. They sang to God, and they weren't anxious about what was going to happen. We know God sent an earthquake and they were released, but they didn't know. They lived it out. And I feel that Paul, as he's writing this letter, in his mind's eye, he's back in those stocks, in that prison, with Silas, rejoicing in all that God has done. Do you know, in this letter to the Philippians, I think he found a measure of joy in Philippi that was new to him, perhaps, because in this letter to the Philippians, 14 times the word joy or rejoice is used. 14 times in this one short letter. It was part of Paul's lifelong experience to rejoice. He was so grateful to God for what he'd done, how he had forgiven him for the terrible things he did in persecuting the church, forgiven him for agreeing to Stephen's death, forgiven him for pursuing the followers of Jesus, and given him a wonderful task. But the suffering he went through, Paul, but for him who suffered so much, shipwrecks and beatings and stonings, being chased out of cities, and his byword was rejoice in the Lord always. And again, I say rejoice. So I say it to you and to me today. Rejoice in the Lord. Rejoice in the Lord. And I say it again. Rejoice. Whatever's going on in your life, you have something to rejoice about. Not one of us is in a situation like Paul was in when he was in Philippi. So rejoice in the Lord always. And again, I say rejoice. Have a great day. I'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.